She actually came? The words landed behind me like a quiet slap, followed by a ripple of laughter sharp enough to cut through the hallway. I didn't turn. I didn't need to. I knew those voices, polished on wealth, softened with privilege, and sharpened whenever I walked by. Even after all these years, they hadn't changed. I paused at the entrance of the auditorium, the warm stage lights spilling out like a secret I wasn't meant to witness. My name glowed on the banner inside, guest speaker, Dr. Arya Hale, but the girls behind me only saw the version of me they made fun of at 13. Maybe she got lost, another one whispered, her amusement dripping onto the floor between us. She never belonged here anyway. Their laughter grew, elegant, rehearsed, and utterly confident that I wouldn't respond. They were right. I didn't respond. I simply breathed, slow, steady, practiced. Humiliation is loud to the person who feels it. But to the world, it's often invisible. I learned that a long time ago. As I stepped inside, the auditorium fell into an uneasy hush. Hundreds of faces turned toward me, some surprised, some curious, some uncomfortably recognizing the girl they once dismissed. My former friends, still lingering in the doorway, stared like they were seeing a ghost wearing confidence they never believed I'd own. I walked toward the stage with unhurried steps, heels clicking against the polished floor, each echo a quiet refusal to shrink. The coordinator approached me with a relieved smile. "Dr. Hale, everyone's been waiting." Behind me, the whispers turned brittle. They didn't know yet. They didn't understand how drastically the roles had shifted. Not then. Not in that moment. But they would. And when they finally discovered who they were really laughing at, silence would be the least of their reactions. Rehook. What happened next would make them question every assumption they ever made about me. The applause that greeted me was polite, formal, almost hesitant. Like the audience wasn't sure if they should clap yet, not until they understood who I had become. I stepped onto the stage with a calm smile, the kind that doesn't ask for approval. The microphone was cool in my hand, the spotlight warm against my skin. Somewhere in the third row, I saw the same girls who mocked me at the entrance settling into their seats, whispering behind manicured fingers. Their faces carried that familiar expression, amusement tinted with disbelief. The same look they wore years ago, when they told me I didn't fit in, as if belonging was something they owned and could issue like a membership card. I met their eyes briefly. They looked away first. But I didn't begin speaking yet. I let the silence grow, not awkwardly, but deliberately. Silence has weight, and tonight, I let it rest on everyone equally. From the stage I noticed details old memories had hidden, a chandelier flickering slightly above the audience, the soft hum of an air conditioner struggling against the heat, rows of expensive suits and diamond bracelets worn by people who never expected to see me anywhere near a podium. Not as a speaker. Certainly not as someone the dean himself had invited. I glanced toward the side wing where the reunion committee stood watching me, their posture straightening every time I shifted. They were waiting, not just for the speech, but for the introduction that would frame my presence here. But I didn't start with success. I didn't start with titles. I didn't start with anything that would make their world comfortable again. Instead, I stepped closer to the mic and spoke with quiet clarity. Before I begin, I want to thank the people who taught me what it feels like to be on the outside of a room I never asked permission to enter. The shift in the auditorium was immediate. A ripple of confusion. A tightening of shoulders. An uncomfortable awareness settling like dust across velvet seats. My former friends froze. They weren't sure if I meant them. They weren't sure if I would say their names. They weren't sure how much I remembered. And that uncertainty. That was the first time I saw fear flicker beneath their practice smiles. Rehook. But they still didn't know the truth, that this stage wasn't my revenge. It was only the beginning of it. I let the silence after my opening line stretch just long enough for unease to settle into the cracks of the room. People shifted in their seats. Cleared their throats. stole glances at one another as if searching for context they'd somehow missed. But the girls in the third row, they didn't move at all. Their stillness was louder than any whisper. I stepped back from the mic, giving the room a moment to breathe before continuing. The stage lights softened around me, casting a warm halo across the front rows. In their glow, I caught a flash of a familiar expression, disbelief trying to disguise itself as confidence. It was the same look they wore years ago when they asked the question that never stopped echoing in my memory. Why do you even try, Arya? People like you don't make it far in our world. That day, I swallowed my hurt with a smile and pretended their words didn't matter. But they carved something into me, not resentment. Direction. I didn't mention that moment outright tonight. I simply let the weight of history sit quietly between us, visible only to those who had been there. Growing up, I began, voice steady, I was taught that belonging is earned, not inherited. But I also learned, too young, maybe, that some people guard belonging like a family heirloom they don't want anyone else to touch. Heads turned. Brows tightened. An emotional current moved across the room, soft but undeniable. One of the girls, Lila, sank a little lower in her chair. She tried to look indifferent, but her fingers kept twisting the ring on her hand, betraying her nerves. I didn't look at her directly, but she knew. They all knew. The dean, standing off to the side, watched me with something close to curiosity. He had invited me because of my accomplishments, yes, but he hadn't expected this. Not the undertone. Not the unspoken story humming beneath every word. I continued softly, measured. Some people spend their lives deciding who fits in. And some of us learn to stop asking for a place. The room held its breath. Literally. Because they could sense it, the boundary between my past and present was thinner than it looked, and they were standing on the wrong side of it. But even then, they still didn't know why I had agreed to return. They didn't know the real reason I walked onto that stage with a calmness they couldn't understand. Rehook. They thought this reunion was about nostalgia, but the truth waiting behind the next moment would unravel their certainty entirely. I could feel the tension shifting, subtle at first, then unmistakable. The audience wasn't simply listening anymore. They were watching, trying to read the subtext threaded through every controlled breath I took. My former friends straightened in their seats, suddenly alert. Their smiles, the elegant, well-practiced ones inherited from wealthy families and privileged hallways, flickered for the first time tonight. I wasn't attacking them. I hadn't said a single name. But truth doesn't need names when guilt already knows where to sit. I moved toward the wooden edge of the stage, letting the light catch only half of my expression, calm, deliberate, unhurried. I wanted them to feel the distance between who I once was and who I had become. When I received the invitation for this reunion, I said gently, I hesitated. A few people exchanged surprised looks. Reunions are supposed to be simple, nostalgia, laughter, old stories polished by time. But my voice made it clear this one was different. I remembered the girl who used to sit alone during lunch, I continued, my tone soft but unwavering. The one who tried too hard to blend in with people who didn't even bother to see her. A hush fell, deeper, sharper. This time, I did look toward the third row. I didn't stare long, just enough for them to feel the quiet acknowledgement of history. 3 pairs of eyes dropped instantly. Good. They remembered too. But, I added, letting a faint smile touch my lips, growth has a way of shifting perspective. What once felt like rejection, now feels like redirection. The entire auditorium absorbed that line. Some nodded knowingly. Others tilted to whisper something half-formed. Yet my childhood friends sat frozen, as if afraid that any movement might confirm something they weren't ready to admit. I lifted my chin slightly, meeting the room with a calm confidence that didn't need applause to feel real. The truth is, I said, I didn't come back here seeking validation. I don't need it. Their confusion deepened, a ripple passing across dozens of faces. If I wasn't here for approval, Then why was I here at all? And no, I continued softly, I didn't come to prove anyone wrong. Life has already done that for me. The girls in the third row exchanged panicked glances. They weren't used to not being in control of the narrative. Not used to someone else holding the room's attention without effort. Not used to their past rising quietly, like a tide they thought would never return. But this wasn't even the twist. This wasn't the revelation that would undo their certainty. This was just the first crack. Re-hook. Because the real reason I returned was sitting in the wings, waiting for the moment that would change everything. You said. For a moment, I stepped back from the mic and let the stage lights dim slightly around me. It wasn't intentional, the technician was adjusting settings, but the shadows it cast made the moment feel intimate, heavier, as if the room itself leaned in to listen. I glanced toward the left wing of the stage. A figure waited there, partially obscured by the curtain. The reunion committee knew he would be coming out later, but no one else did, certainly not the women in the third row who had built their confidence on the assumption that my life had remained small, predictable, and unimpressive. What ultimately made me accept the invitation, I said, letting my voice fall to a quieter register, was a conversation with someone from our past. Confusion rippled through the room. A few people straightened. Someone shifted their drink nervously. Even the dean raised an eyebrow. But the real reaction came from them. Lila, Marin, and Julia. 3 faces stiffened at once. Their fingers tightened around their handbags. Their postures sharpened, like prey suddenly realizing a predator had entered the clearing. I didn't look directly at them, but I felt their panic from across the room. Yes, I continued softly, someone reached out to me. Someone I hadn't spoken to in years. I paused, long enough for their imaginations to start tearing open old memories. Who had they wronged besides me? Who remembered the things they wanted buried? Whose name would sting the most if spoken aloud tonight? I let the tension stretch, a slow, deliberate pull. When he called, I said, he told me something I didn't expect, something that made coming here less of a choice and more of a necessity. A few gasps fluttered through the rows. He. The word alone shifted their expressions from discomfort to fear. Because there was only one he whose opinion they ever cared about. One person whose presence could unravel their carefully constructed versions of the past. One person they hurt as casually as they hurt me, but whose silence always worried them more. Behind the curtain, he shifted his weight, waiting for his cue. He didn't need to speak yet. His existence in this story was enough to make their certainty fracture. And for the first time tonight, the power dynamic inverted. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just quietly, unmistakably. They no longer wondered if they should laugh at me. They wondered what I knew. Re-hook. Because when his name finally reached their ears, everything they thought they controlled would start to slip away. I returned to the mic slowly, almost thoughtfully, giving them time to drown in their own assumptions. If there's one thing people like them fear more than the truth, it's not knowing which truth is about to surface. Before I reveal what he told me, I said gently, I want to share something I learned over the years. I paced the stage, not nervously, but with controlled calm, the kind that comes from surviving the kind of silence that once swallowed your voice whole. My heels echoed softly, a measured rhythm beneath the thickening tension. When you grow up being underestimated, I continued, you learn to listen differently. You hear things people don't intend you to hear. You remember things they forget you were ever there to witness. A quiet shiver passed through the front rows. But it was the third row I watched from the corner of my eye. Their bodies spoke louder than their words ever had. Lila's jaw clenched so tightly I could see the line of muscle flickering beneath her skin. Julia's posture stiffened, spine straight as if bracing for impact. Marin's hand trembled, subtly but unmistakably, as she reached for her glass of water. They already knew who he was. Their eyes gave them away before I ever said his name. Still, they prayed, desperately, that I wouldn't say it. I smiled faintly, not unkindly. I wasn't here to humiliate them. Truth has its own dignity, and I refused to stoop below it. When he reached out, I said, he told me he had been keeping something for years, something he believed I deserved to know. The audience leaned in. Here it was, the tightening coil, the quiet shift from curiosity to unease. No one coughed. No chair shifted. The entire auditorium held itself perfectly still. Even the dean folded his hands, anticipation drawing his brows together. I took one slow breath. He said he regretted staying silent back then. That he should have spoken up when it mattered, for me, and for himself. A collective shiver. Silence swallowed the room. I didn't speak his name yet. I wanted them to sit in the tension of the unsaid, the space between memory and consequence. Because they weren't afraid of the man himself. They were afraid of what he remembered. And they still had no idea how much of their past had survived in someone else's hands. Rehook. But the moment I finally said his name out loud, the reunion would never feel the same again, for any of us. You said. I stepped closer to the microphone, the light catching the quiet determination settling across my features. You could feel the anticipation snapping at the edges of the room like static, invisible, but impossible to ignore. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Sometimes the softest words carry the deepest impact. The person who reached out to me, I said calmly, was Ethan Cole. And the reaction was instant. A gasp, sharp and collective, cut through the auditorium like a blade slicing cloth. Not dramatic, just painfully honest. Lila's hand flew to her mouth. Julia's eyes widened before she could hide it. Marin went completely still, as if her spine had turned to glass. Ethan. The boy they once adored for his charm, his ease, his brilliance. The boy they used, in ways they pretended were harmless. The boy who saw more than they ever intended him to see. The boy who disappeared from this circle long before I did. Because he understood, earlier than any of us, that proximity to them was a slow erosion of self. I watched their reactions with the same calmness I had cultivated through years of being underestimated. This moment wasn't about revenge. It was about truth, the quiet kind that slips beneath your skin and stays there. I spoke with Ethan for nearly 2 hours, I said, letting the surprise settle into the audience. He remembered everything. More than I expected. More than they expected. People turned toward the third row, slowly, subtly, but unmistakably. Spotlights didn't expose them. Their own expressions did. Ethan told me he once believed silence protected him, I continued. But he finally realized silence only protects people who don't deserve it. Lila swallowed hard. Julia pressed her nails into her palm. Marin's composure cracked, just slightly, but enough for me to see the truth. They weren't remembering one incident. They were remembering several. Before leaving the country, I added quietly, he wrote something he never sent. A letter. The room shifted again. Curiosity bloomed. Fear deepened. He wanted me to read it tonight. A quiet murmur rippled through the crowd, half disbelief, half hunger for whatever came next. I lifted a folded paper from the podium, its edges worn from time and hesitation. Their eyes locked onto it like it was a detonator. They had no idea what Ethan had written. No idea what he had kept to himself all these years. No idea which truths had finally found a voice. Rehook. And when I began reading his letter aloud, their past would unravel far faster than they ever imagined. I unfolded the letter slowly, letting the soft crinkle of paper echo across the auditorium. It was such an ordinary sound. But in that moment, it carried the weight of a decade. The room leaned forward as if pulled by a single thread. I didn't dramatize the moment. I didn't need to. Ethan's words had their own quiet gravity. I began reading. Arya. I should have said this years ago. I should have stood beside you when it mattered, instead of staying silent in a crowd that pretended kindness while practicing cruelty. A tremor ran through the rows, small, barely audible, but undeniable. Some of the alumni exchanged glances. Others shifted uncomfortably, as if recognizing the truth in the tone alone. But the third row was frozen. I continued. I watched them laugh at you. I watched them diminish you. And I watched you carry that pain with a grace none of them could ever match. My voice stayed calm, steady, not accusatory, just honest. Ethan's handwriting slanted slightly, the ink darker in some places, as if emotional pressure had pressed heavier into the page. They mocked the way you dressed. The way you spoke. The way you never tried to impress them. And they mistook your quiet for weakness. A few people inhaled sharply. Ethan had never been the type to exaggerate. If he wrote it, he meant it. I lifted my eyes from the letter, only briefly, to see the girls who once defined themselves by their power over others. Their facades were cracking, inch by inch. Julia's face had lost its color. Lila blinked too fast, her composure slipping like sand through her fingers. Marin stared at the floor, as if hoping it would swallow the truth before it reached her. But the letter had just begun. I didn't speak up then because I was a coward. Not because I didn't see the truth, but because I was afraid of losing the approval of people who were never worth admiring. A ripple of shock, sharper than before. Ethan had never said a single negative word about them publicly. His silence had always been their safety net. Not anymore. I lowered the letter slightly, letting the weight of Ethan's confession sink into every corner of the room. And that, I said quietly, was only the first half of what he wrote. Dozens of eyes widened. Breath stopped. The air thickened with a suspense that bordered on fear. Because now they understood. If the first half was this honest, the second half would expose everything they'd built their reputation upon. Rehook. And when I read the next lines, the lines Ethan wrote specifically about them, the reunion would shift from uncomfortable to unforgettable. I lifted the letter again, the paper trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of what came next. The room braced itself without even realizing it. I continued reading. Arya. The second reason I'm writing this letter is not about you. It's about them. About what they did, and what everyone conveniently forgot. A collective exhale broke across the auditorium like a quiet wave. The girls in the third row stiffened, their shoulders rising in the same rhythm, three shadows bracing for a storm they once believed would never find them again. I read on. They didn't just mock you. The words rolled through the room, steady and cold. They targeted you. Soft gasps. A few murmured, "Oh God," under their breath. They isolated you on purpose, for sport. A pause. And they did the same to me. This time, the audience didn't gasp. They froze. Ethan Cole, the charming boy with the easy smile and quiet brilliance, had never admitted that anyone hurt him. Not once. Not to anyone. The silence that followed was raw, almost tender with disbelief. I continued. They used me when they needed attention. Forgot me when someone richer walked by. Played the kind of mind games people mistake for harmless fun. Until someone disappears. Julia pressed a shaking hand to her forehead. Lila's eyes filled with tears she refused to blink away. Marin looked like she was suffocating on a truth she had swallowed years ago. I didn't slow down. They started rumors about you. About your family. About why you didn't belong here. As if belonging was theirs to assign. A few people in the audience turned toward the trio with expressions of disgust and dawning recognition. Others shifted uncomfortably, realizing they had witnessed pieces of it. And done nothing. The letter continued. They were cruel because it was easy. They were loud because they expected silence in return. But the thing they feared most was the day either of us would stop being silent. The room felt smaller suddenly. More intimate. More honest. I lowered the letter slightly, letting the weight of Ethan's words fill the space between past and present. There was no anger in my expression. No satisfaction. Just a quiet truth settling into the cracks time had tried to seal. But Ethan wasn't finished. I read the next lines slowly, deliberately. Arya. If you're reading this at the reunion, they're finally hearing what they've earned. Not punishment. Not revenge. Just truth. The trio's breaths were shallow, their eyes glossy with the realization that this moment, this reckoning, was something Ethan had prepared long before tonight. And still, this wasn't the part that would break them. Not yet. Because Ethan had included one last truth, the one they never wanted anyone to know. Rehook. And when I revealed the final lines of Ethan's letter, the room would learn exactly why he left, and why he wanted the world to know now. The air in the auditorium felt brittle, like one wrong breath would cause it to crack apart. I held the letter gently, as if it were something fragile, not because of the paper, but because of the truth inside it. Everyone watched me now. Not with curiosity. Not with politeness. But with the kind of silence reserved for truths that finally rise after years of being buried. I lifted the page again. Arya. There's one last thing I never told you, or anyone. The reason I left. The room tensed all at once. Even the dean, composed until now, leaned forward. I didn't leave the country for better opportunities. I left because of them. A wave of shock rippled across the audience, quiet but sharp. Lila inhaled sharply. Julia's lips parted in disbelief. Marin whispered something under her breath, a shaky plea only she could hear. But I continued, calm and steady. Do you remember the scholarship interview I missed? I paused, letting the memory settle, one many had wondered about but never questioned. They sabotaged it. A woman in the second row gasped. Someone else whispered, "Oh my God." I read on, my voice even. They sent a fake message from the committee telling me the time had changed. They thought it was funny, a harmless prank. But that interview was my only chance. Julia covered her face with trembling fingers. Lila shook her head violently, as if denying the truth could erase it. Marin's eyes filled with tears she didn't bother hiding. But this was Ethan's truth. Not theirs to rewrite. I didn't say anything because I didn't want to look weak. But the truth is, I broke that day. Not because I lost the scholarship, but because I realized the people I laughed with were laughing at me. Silence. A hollow, aching silence. Ethan had been their prize, the charming boy they flaunted, the friend they claimed. But behind closed doors, they treated him the same way they treated me. As entertainment. As someone who didn't matter. As someone who would never speak. But he had spoken. Through this letter. Through every line that now echoed off the auditorium walls. I folded the paper slowly. The audience wasn't looking at me anymore. They were looking at the third row, at the women who once dictated the social order of their school with perfect smiles and sharp tongues. Now those smiles were gone. Broken. Exposed. Human. But the story wasn't over. There was still one final truth, one Ethan had asked me to deliver in person. Rehook. And when I told them what Ethan wanted me to say directly to their faces, the final shift in power would strike with undeniable clarity. I placed the folded letter gently on the podium. The silence it left behind was heavier than the words inside it, a silence full of reckoning, full of recognition, full of the truths everyone wished they had seen earlier. But this part wasn't written on paper. It was entrusted to me. I stepped forward, just slightly, letting the light soften across my face. The auditorium watched with the kind of stillness that only arrives when the truth becomes unavoidable. Ethan asked me to tell you something directly, I began quietly. No anger. No triumph. Just calm, controlled honesty. Every head turned toward the third row. Lila's breath hitched. Julia's trembling hands lowered from her face. Marin looked as if the chair beneath her might collapse. I continued. He wanted you to know one thing above everything else. Their eyes locked onto mine, wide, pleading, terrified in the way only people with long-buried guilt can be. I didn't blink. He said, I forgive you. But I don't want silence to protect you anymore. A single, broken sound escaped from somewhere deep in the audience, a gasp mixed with disbelief. Forgiveness. Not revenge. Not hatred. But exposure. Honest exposure. I let the words settle. Not as a weapon, but as a release. Ethan said he isn't asking for apologies, I continued softly. He isn't asking for reconciliation. He simply wanted the truth to breathe, finally. The trio's reactions fractured further. Lila covered her trembling lips, tears slipping past the edges she used to guard so fiercely. Julia stared ahead, stunned, as if her entire past had rearranged itself in front of her. Marin whispered, I didn't know. I didn't know it broke him, but her voice crumbled on the lie. The audience shifted, empathy for Ethan, disappointment directed at the trio, and a dawning realization that cruelty, even polished cruelty, leaves a trail. But I wasn't done. Because Ethan had asked me to deliver one last message, not to them, but to everyone. He said, tell them I'm not coming back to the past. I'm building a life where people like them can't decide my worth. A soft murmur spread, admiration, regret, heartbreak. I let my voice soften further, almost tender. And he said, tell Arya she never needed a place at their table. She was meant to build her own. Those words landed differently. Not as accusation. Not as vengeance. But as truth, liberating, irrefutable truth. The room shifted again, but this time the shift came from me, the calm acceptance, the strength, the clarity. Because Ethan wasn't just revealing their cruelty. He was acknowledging my resilience. And they knew it. But this wasn't the climax. There was one final moment they never expected, the moment that would define everything that came after. Rehook. Because when the person waiting in the wings finally stepped out, the reunion would witness a truth none of them were prepared to confront. A subtle shift in the stage curtain drew every pair of eyes toward the left wing. No announcement. No cue. Just a presence, quiet, deliberate, stepping toward the light. For a heartbeat, the audience held its breath. Then he appeared. Ethan Cole. Older, sharper around the edges, his once boyish charm replaced with a maturity that carried both grace and ache. His posture wasn't proud or triumphant, it was steady, composed, almost serene. There was no bitterness in his eyes. No desire to humiliate. Just a calmness that made the truth feel even heavier. The trio in the third row froze as if the ground beneath them had vanished. Ethan's gaze met mine first, a small, grateful nod passing between us. Not for exposing anything, but for honoring what he had carried alone for so long. Then his eyes moved to them. He didn't glare. He didn't smirk. He didn't even frown. He simply looked at them, really looked, in a way that left no room to pretend the past hadn't happened. Silence settled like fog. He stepped closer to the mic beside me, his voice low, clear, steady. I didn't come back to shame anyone, he said. I came because this chapter deserved to be closed in truth, not silence. The audience shifted, some wiping tears, others holding their breath. He turned his body slightly toward the third row. You hurt me, Ethan said quietly. And you hurt Arya. Maybe you didn't think it mattered. Maybe you assumed time would hide it. Julia flinched. Lila began silently crying. Marin clutched her trembling fingers together. Ethan continued, his tone calm but unshakable. But growth is about acknowledging what we once were, so we can choose who we want to be now. No condemnation. No dramatics. Just truth, spoken with a dignity they couldn't diminish. And I want you to know, he added gently, that forgiveness doesn't erase what happened. It just means I'm done carrying it. The auditorium swallowed his words whole. He turned back to me then, offering a soft, genuine smile, one that carried relief, gratitude, and a quiet resilience. I returned it. Because this wasn't just his closure. It was mine too. I stepped forward, addressing the room one final time. Tonight isn't about blame, I said softly. It's about clarity. About finally letting the truth breathe after years of silence. People nodded, some visibly moved, others introspective. But the trio? They sat trembling, not because they were being punished, but because they were finally being seen without the armor of their old status. Ethan exhaled deeply, a weight leaving his shoulders after years of being held there. This moment, this quiet, powerful reckoning, wasn't revenge. It was release. A release neither they nor the audience had been prepared to witness. But the story wasn't finished. Because every truth has its aftermath. And every ending reveals who people truly are. Rehook. And as we walked off that stage together, the final shift began, not for them, but for me. The moment we stepped off stage, the noise of the auditorium softened behind us, a muted hum of whispers, shifting chairs, and the aftershock of truth finally spoken aloud. I exhaled slowly. Not out of exhaustion, but out of release. Ethan walked beside me, his steps unhurried, his shoulders lighter than when he arrived. For years, he had carried a silence that didn't belong to him. Tonight, he set it down gently and walked away from it without looking back. I didn't think I'd ever return here, he said quietly. I didn't think I'd return either, I replied. We shared a small, knowing smile, two people who had once been defined by someone else's cruelty, now standing in the quiet aftermath of reclaiming our own truth. Behind us, the auditorium door remained closed, trapping the old version of that world inside. Ahead of us, the hallway stretched open and bright, washed in warm evening light spilling through the tall windows. For the first time all night, I felt weightless. As we crossed the lobby, a few alumni approached, not with pity, but with sincerity. Some apologized for their silence back then. Others admitted they hadn't seen the cruelty for what it was. I didn't need their words. But I accepted them anyway. Growth isn't about proving the past wrong. It's about letting the present stand on its own. Ethan paused by the exit, hands in his pockets, breathing in the cool night air. You know, he said softly, you didn't need to read that letter for me. I could have just told them myself. I shook my head gently. It wasn't for them, I said. It was for you, and for the girl I used to be. He smiled, a soft, grateful smile that reached his eyes. You did more than that, he said. You showed them who you've become. But the truth was simpler than that. I didn't need them to recognize me. I didn't need their approval, their remorse, or their validation. I had already built a life far beyond their reach, a life shaped by resilience, not revenge. And tonight was proof that the most powerful justice isn't loud. It doesn't demand recognition. It doesn't destroy. It simply reveals. As Ethan walked toward his car, I stayed by the doorway for a moment, watching the campus I once walked through with small steps and quiet fear. Now, the buildings looked smaller. The memories softer. The past, finally distant. I whispered into the cool evening air, not for them, not for Ethan, but for myself. I belonged all along. I just didn't need their invitation. Then I turned, my heels clicking with a confidence I earned one quiet victory at a time. This wasn't revenge. This was closure. And sometimes, silence is the loudest revenge of all. Rehook, final. Because in the end, the people who once tried to define my worth became the reason I stopped seeking permission to exist.